I can remember the early 2000s, back when I was a young buck fresh out of Ivy League college with my corporate dreams still intact. I started interviewing with the big block investment banks and asset management firms with one goal in mind, to eventually be able to invest other people's money using quantitative systems. That was my end goal. Of course, with my students' pockets almost empty, money was a major focus as well, because it had to be. But even though I obviously couldn't be promoted to a quantitative trader right from the jump, as long as that career path would ultimately lead me to it, I was in for the ride. It took me 6 short years to get there, yet fast forward another 11 years in an international career, tectonic industry changes, and with a bank account now looking like I could make it on my own, I couldn't see myself doing this any longer, or at least working for someone else. This is why I left to become an independent quant. If you're aspiring to become a full-time trader, whether employed or independent, chances are that you may have watched the classic Wolf of Wall Street movie.
I want you to go out there, and I want you to ram Steve Madden's stock down your clients' throats till they fucking choke on it. Yeah. Till they choke on it and they buy 100,000 shares. That's what I want you to do. You be ferocious. You be relentless. You be telephone fucking terrorist. Now let's knock this motherfucker out of the park.
For anyone like myself who's been in this industry during the so-called modern times, it's hard to even fathom that sell-side business was conducted that way back then, especially so after 2008. For those of you who are old enough to have experienced it as an adult, the subprime debacle brought in a torrential flood of top-down regulatory tightening in banking, lending, and asset management as a whole, and truth be told, most of it was accomplished as a political stunt to soothe the public outrage after the industry was enabled to essentially make their private losses public with the complicit help of said regulators and as bonus, central banks worldwide. The problem with most of these new rules is that apart from imposing most conservative solvency ratios on bank reserves and making investment procedures a pain in the neck, the changes were mostly cosmetic and political if we were to gauge them by their efficacy in terms of net benefits for the end client. In fact, what truly changed is how the hierarchy and the organizational structure shifted in banks and funds after this crisis. You see, in order to both be able to carry out this tedious stack of new regulations, the asset management industry went on a hiring frenzy to recruit armies of compliance officers and all kinds of paper pushers. And despite becoming a de facto cost center for the banks, compliance took the lead on just about everything. You have to understand that it is nothing else but the fear of regulatory backlash and financial sanctions that suddenly caught everyone by storm like a deer in the headlights and changed the corporate priorities from maximizing upside to that of minimizing downside. Most importantly, the prop desks that typically acted both as a money machine and a skill set incubator for aspiring traders and portfolio managers on their career paths got also axed in the process. This was accomplished by the Dodd-Frank Act that eventually passed in 2010, introducing more than 400 rules and mandates and resulted in $27 billion taken out of the economy, 2,600 new full-time federal employees, and cost the US taxpayer more than $3 billion without, of course, putting an end to the outrageous too-big-to-fail bailout programs. And so in the industry, this profound change made the bank's bottom line shift from traders who used to be the stars and collected high rewards because of generating most of the pool of income to compliance, who took over and somehow could now justify a large share of the pool by how much downside it prevented. Having lived that change on the front lines, I can tell you that it didn't take long before the working environment turned into constant day-to-day harassment on traders and portfolio managers. I'm talking about a working environment littered with more forms to fill out, non-stop meetings to inform us about the latest rules and requirements, artificially convoluted investment processes to give a semblance of increased risk control, keeping trails of everything related to trading down to the most mundane details, endless suitability tests for clients who had been vetted for years if not decades, and so on. And of course, my favorite, an obsession for unrelating corporate investment committees, where general investment guidance was given to us with risk parameters obviously coming from people who were reading from a manual and clearly never had placed a single trade in their entire lives. In that context, context, most banks and funds turned themselves into glorified post offices where compliance was all the rage. I'm being a little facetious here, of course, but actually not as much as you might think. In any case, that was my first wake-up call that my career had then entered a countdown, since I clearly wasn't going to share my pursuit of excellence with a crowd focused on a race to the bottom in terms of competency. Now, as you might have understood it, this defensive organizational shift would have been bad enough already if it had stuck to just crippling day-to-day operations. The issue is that it also ignited a cultural shift as well that encouraged shying away from risk-taking and intellectual curiosity over to a glorification of dumbing down investment processes with the only goal of making everything more controllable. All of which was dictated by people with zero qualifications in actual asset management who were incentivized to not understand and to not push back. Quants were affected the worst. Why? Because building your edge as a quant requires creativity, sophistication, and confidentiality, none of which can express themselves fully in an environment that seeks to standardize, simplify, and straight up eviscerate any original financial solutions, ideas, and innovation. So not only was this culture enforced on new recruits, veterans like myself were treated with the same scrutiny regardless of tenure and impeccable standings as far as performance, client satisfaction, and risk management. In fact, funnily enough, we were carefully kept away from interviewing new candidates because they knew our competency requirements and the focus of our interviews, none of which matched how they wanted to mold their new employees. Blind compliance over financial competency was the unspoken motto. And naturally, the average skills level in the trading room started plummeting with every passing new regulation. And as with everything cultural, politics then took over and started filling the void left by actual talent. More and more time had to be made to satisfy the new political hype of the moment, most notably as related to woke office culture and literally having to go through regular and compulsory trainings on such bullshit as Me Too and LGBTQ or anything ESG related, some of which were even conducted right smack in the middle of trading hours, if you can believe that. Imagine trying to reach investment excellence in that environment. Now, inevitably, as the general pool of skill set went down the toilet, so did work ethics. The new recruits in the trading room, the vast majority of which were young and malleable and obviously didn't know any better, ended up being hired in priority as opposed to seasoned veterans, all of which in order to ensure that the risk of staff non-compliance would be kept to a minimum, of course. The problem with that defensive stance, obsessed with the goal of zero risk and despite all the hype about so-called quote-unquote protecting clients, was on the contrary that it created tremendous actual fiduciary harm to said clients. How so? Well, first, this harm materialized either directly in the form of financial cost of opportunity because of the increasingly narrow investment universe and solutions, and then indirectly because the job of sell-side traders and buy-side portfolio managers became reduced to a large degree to that of first or second-hand glorified salespeople whose entire career purpose became in many ways a mission to shove canned and standardized financial products down their clients' throats, essentially acting like brainless robots, applying pre-made portfolio models and allocations regardless of their true clients' needs and even less so of long-term expectancy. In other words, truly maximizing performance and therefore actually putting the client first became an afterthought, all the while with the blessing of compliance, which became more concerned in the end about building a squeaky clean facade to please regulators than with the adverse consequences of following orders on the managed assets. In fact, believe it or not, towards the end, the word performance itself was almost immediately perceived with suspicion during meetings, like bordering with a sign of professional recklessness. I am not even joking. As you can understand it, this unethical investment mission became too much for me to take, because I just couldn't look my clients in the eye any longer. And unlike most, there is no price tag you can put on my integrity, and I will not do anything for a paycheck. The last reason why I eventually left is a consequence of the first three, and the most important one to me. You see, this culture of oversight everything not only created the perfect environment to push talent away by only keeping the older followers, it started creeping beyond the office into everybody's personal lives, to the point that people in the bank that nobody had ever met felt entitled to becoming extremely intrusive in the trader's own intellectual property. You need to understand that while you are certainly bound by your work contract to protect the intellectual property, the research, and the investment processes of the institution that you work for, nothing forces you to disclose the research that you perform on your end, on your own dime, and in your off time out of pure intellectual curiosity. These are your own, and nothing but your own, or at least they should be. And if you have subscribed to this channel for long enough, you know that I am an avid proponent of chasing your goals by putting in the extra work at home, in between work days, and into your own self after your regular job hours. And yes, that means no Netflix and chill, and not hanging out for a drink with your colleagues after work. Cry me a river. In my case, the difference that I made over everybody else was made by thinking out of the box, doing math research, and broadening my skill set to other trading related tasks, typically doing it between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m. These 3 or 4 hours of extra work per day during weekdays added up tremendously and have literally changed my entire financial life for the better, with dividends that I am still reaping years later. The message that I want to get through to you guys is that it is the only way to eventually become full stack as a quant trader. And this very extra work is what allowed me to leave the rat race and retire at the age of 40 to trade my own capital. Now here is how it ties up to reason number 4 of why I left. What pushed me off the edge is when this compulsive need for corporate control over the traders and portfolio managers started intruding into my own intellectual property, meaning that even though my trading was applying the recommended processes and was operating well within the bounds prescribed by compliance, I was also striving to not go numb in the head by adding extra value through my own techniques in asset selection and allocations for the benefit of the clients. And that got noticed, if only because of my higher and steadier performance. That is when I got called in to basically twist my arm into giving up my own trade secrets and background algorithms that I would run, mind you, from my home computer and prior to coming to work every day. You heard me correctly. They literally had the audacity to demand that I give up years of work to them for free, all for the sake of so-called transparency, of course. And that was the red line that I drew in the sand and was not ready to cross. Not to mention the fact that at this point, I had accumulated enough capital and a mountain of skills to make it on my own in such a way that the cost of opportunity of staying then became much larger than the compensation that I was offered. So I bounced, much to the chagrin of my clients that I had known forever at that point. And I left a secure, high-paying career and tenure that many would die for. But that environment had reached the point where it was numbing me intellectually, and I felt my soul leaving my body a little more every day. The only alternative that was left to me in the industry at that point would have been compromising my ethics at the expense of the clients by requiring from me that I knowingly dumb down my performance, all for the sake of remaining compliant, or selling my soul for cash by giving up the unique techniques that I had worked so hard to acquire on my own. I think you get the point. But I'm curious, what would you have done? Before I close this video, I want to make very clear that I am not trashing the asset management industry and its entire culture as a whole. There still are some great people in there that are trying every day to give the best to their clients despite all the regulations. Also, this career, however intense it was, gave me the opportunity to live some unforgettable experiences and meet some of the most talented and unique people that I know, with decade-long friendships that still hold to this day. And believe it or not, I would still recommend it if only as a starting ground for aspiring traders that are fresh out of school. Just don't come in with delusions and expectations of an industry that it no longer is. You likely will not make it a lifelong career if you have a minimum of integrity. You are not only going to face the grind of mastering the markets and meeting your fiduciary duties, you are more than ever going to have to wrestle with a lot of politics and parasitic people along the way that will work against you and detract you from achieving that goal. So more than ever, you will have to put in the extra work on your own when others are calling it a day. That is the only way to make a difference. If anything, use my example as proof that you can use this phase in your work life as a stepping stone for a ticket to make it on your own, and then live the best rewarding life that you can get financially, intellectually, and most importantly, with the freedom to live your life on your own terms. It's your turn now. Make it count.
Hey, hey,